Well, hello, welcome. Today is Monday, which means it's paint along day. And that means that I get to teach you guys something new using some bold brush strokes and some dramatic color. If you are new here, my name is Allie, and I'm a painting instructor. So I teach a technique that I work with. I guess a lot of people ask me like what the name for my technique is, and I guess I call it contemporary impressionism. But basically what that means is I like to use some just strong brush work and just really rich, fun colors. And it's all about light and shadow. So that's what I'm going to teach you in this demo today. Hi, Teresa. Hi, Jan. So I mentioned earlier, I do something different each week. I do a live demo at 5 Eastern every Monday, and it's an hour-long demo. And today is the Apple Harvest Paint Along. So we've been working in a little series here that's kind of seasonal. Last week we did a spooky skeleton, which was a lot of fun. And before that we did pumpkins. So today I thought, fall, let's do some apples. I thought that would be a fun little lesson to teach you. And there's a lot we can learn from painting the apple. It's kind of a simple subject, but there's really a lot to it. So I think we're gonna have a lot of fun today. So I always like to give a little rundown of how this works because we often have new people. So these demos are free to watch. You can access them anytime. You can watch the replay after this is done. And I also have put together an outlines download for you. So it's a template that you can print on your home printer and trace onto your 8x10 panel so that when you start this demo, you already have your outlines and they will match mine perfectly. So you can find that on my website, alliekstudio.com. So if you're just joining me and you don't have the download, don't worry. You can always watch this as a replay. In fact, a lot of my students like to watch it live and then they go back afterwards and paint it. So that is totally fine. So hey, let's get started on this painting, all right? So here we go. I'm gonna bring in the camera here and show you what we are working on. So I think we've got a reference image you can see. I like to show you a little bit of my palette and a little bit of my painting there. Well, hopefully all of my painting, right? All right. Hi, Jan in Chattanooga. That's where I am. And we have another Jan as well. I don't see where the other Jan is from. And hi, Mickey. Hi, Laura in Connecticut. All right, thanks for saying hi, guys. And anyone else who is watching, please feel free to jump into the comments and say hi and let us know where you're watching from. It's always fun to see that. So again, I mentioned how we have the outlines on here already, and I am using golden fluid acrylics for this demo. Those are my paints of choice. If you get the download, it has a list of the paints that I am using so that you can get the same paints that I have and make it easier for you to mix your colors and match them. And I just painted over these outlines after I transferred them onto my image using a sheet of transfer paper. I painted over them using a light purple that I made from alizarin crimson, Payne's gray, and titanium white. So I just like to do that to kind of cover up my pencil marks so that I'm just starting with only paint showing on my panel. All right, so first things first, we like to kick it off by mapping out our shadows. So I start with purple that I make from alizarin crimson and Payne's gray, and I'm watering it down. I'm making a real soupy puddle of it here. I want it pretty watery so that I can get it to flow and not be too dark. And then I'm just offloading my brush on the edge of my panel here, and I'm kind of blotting it a little bit so that I can come back and just grab some at the tip. That way it's not going to have too much of this watery mixture on my brush. Hi Francine in Alaska and Kelly in Texas. Wow, we have all kinds of people joining us today. I love it. All right, so I'm working with a flat tip brush. These are Royal Langnickel brushes that I'm using. They are not expensive brushes. I like a synthetic hair brush, just nice smooth brush, because we want to be able to see these brush strokes. So basically what I'm doing first is I'm just looking at the lines that I've put down, and I'm asking myself which side of the line is light and which side of the line is dark. So I see that up here the background is darker than this rim of the bowl that I have here. So I'm just lightly washing in the background to show that that rim of the bowl is going to be a highlight. And then it's also dark inside the bowl. So I'm going to wash in up to that edge inside the bowl, and I can see that it's dark behind this apple. So I see this is a nice dark shape right here that I can pull out right away, and it's pretty easy to identify. I think this is going to be a pretty, I don't want to say an easy demo, but I think it's going to be a good demo for people who are maybe new to what I'm teaching here, because we have pretty identifiable shapes. So that's gonna help us to not get as confused as maybe if we were doing like a bouquet of flowers that were all kind of mixed together. I think these shapes are fairly easy to recognize, so that's going to be nice for us. So still kind of washing in the background here. But now on the left side of this apple, it's going to flip. Now the apple is darker and the background is lighter. So I mapped out this kind of dark shape on the apple that's creeping up along the edge. So I'm going to wash that in. So a lot of the way that I paint and the way that I teach is really paying attention to those little subtle flips where now it's light in the back and the subject has the shadow on it. So we really want to be accurate and paint what's really there, not what we think we see, what we actually see. All right, so now we've got, again, it's gonna flip. So now the edge, actually I'm gonna push that in a little bit, because now we've got a dark shadow on this green apple, and the right edge of this apple is going to be the lighter tone. And then we've got a dark edge in between these two, and now the dark shadow is on this one in the back, and it's actually gonna wrap all the way up around on the back so that this top edge is going to glow on this apple. Hi Clyde in North Carolina, and we've got Debbie in Pennsylvania. Thanks for saying hi, everyone. And we've got Robbie in Utah. Awesome. All right, big group today. I love it. So we're not paying attention to the color. We are just looking at light and dark. So we've got dark behind this one. So by focusing just on light and dark right now, it allows us to really get a lot done without having to, change our paint color. We're looking at these light and darks and basically just thinking of this as like a black and white painting for right now. Now we will be adding quite a bit of color, but we're not worried about that right now. And this is just the first pass. So we are going to push some of our darks a little bit darker later. Like, for example, the stem is really dark, and I'm not worried about putting it in super dark right now. I'm just I'm deciding like 50%, the darker 50% is what I'm washing in with this light wash. And then as we want to separate those even darker values later, we will push those darker in the next pass of this color. Hi, Melissa in the UK, and we've got Dominique in Quebec. We have all kinds of people today, and I know that it's much later over in the UK, so I appreciate you guys making a point to join me. All right, so now we want to remember that this line here is light, and so it's dark underneath it. So I'm gonna wash this in dark. And down here, there's a shadow below the bowl, and it actually gets even darker, but I'm not gonna worry about separating those right now because I'll separate those in the next pass. So I'm just gonna wash all of this in. And as long as I can still see my lines, that's fine. I don't want to be working with a wash that's going to be so dark that I lose those lines, because I'm gonna need those lines for my next pass of color where I am going to be pushing those darker shadows even darker. I wanna be able to see where they are so I know where I need to do that. All right, got Jackie in California, so not quite as late in California. It's mid-afternoon there. I try to find the best time to do these paint-alongs, and it seems like that's a hard task. All right. So we're almost done with this first pass of color. And you know, I'm gonna identify these stripes. So this stripe is a light one. The next one's going to be a dark one. So I'm just gonna do a wash over that, and then another wash. There we go. Just so I can tell what's what there. All right. And you know, I think I'm actually just gonna wash this whole area in under the bowl because that is going to be all darker. Okay, so I think that works for our first pass. Let me put a little shadow here since I made a line there. All right. Now we're ready to come back with our next pass of color. So like I said, we're going to come back with a darker tone. So this is going to be more alizarin crimson and Payne's gray, but now I'm going to have less water in it. And I'm still going to have a little bit of water, but not quite as soupy as what we had before. And again, you can scrape your brush on the side of your palette. I get these palettes from Hobby Lobby, and I like them because they peel off, the paint peels off once it's dry, but I also like this sharp edge that's between the wells because it's a good place for me to scrape my brush and offload it. All right, so now I'm gonna go back, like I said, and I wanna find those darker shadows. So I can see that there's this dark shadow that's coming down on the bowl here. You can see how this new tone is darker than what was there before. And it's also pretty dark back here. So by washing over again and creating this new darker value, it's going to help us to create that gradient which is going to give us the illusion of form and depth by having these different values. And it's pretty dark in the back here, right at the edge of the bowl. I'm not going to wash in the whole background equally dark. I'm just looking for where I see it the darkest. Pretty dark down here. Now, over here on the right side where I'm working right now, I see a little indication of another apple, but when the time comes to put the color in and paint that apple, I'm not gonna put that apple in there. I'm going to take some artistic liberty and say, you know, that just doesn't work with the composition. It leaves us kind of hanging too much. So by leaving that apple out, I think it's going to just make my composition seem a little bit more intentional. So those are the kind of things you can do when you are behind the paintbrush. You don't have to include everything that you see in the reference image. You can ask yourself, like, does this work with what I'm trying to do? And if the answer is no, then just leave it out. You get to be in charge of that. I think that's something that I really like about painting, is you have that control of deciding what's going to be in there. I work pretty closely from photos, but it doesn't mean that I let the photo 100% dictate what's going to be in the composition. Because we want it to work for what we're trying to do. All right. Pretty dark in here. Now, I often say, you know, use loose brush strokes, don't be too tight. However, when you are painting an arc of like a bowl or something that we know is round, you need to be spot on. So if this arc is a little bit wonky, like if your arm, you know, wobbles a little bit and you get like a weird bump, you got to fix it, because otherwise it's going to make the whole composition seem inaccurate. So when you're doing an arc like that, that is one place where I would say, yeah, go ahead and tense up or prop your hand like this, or do what you need to do to be able to have a steady hand and get that arc just right. We do that work in the underpainting. This is called the underpainting, what we're doing right now. And we're gonna get our underpainting extremely technical and accurate. And that will allow us, as we layer more color in the overpainting, that will allow us to be a little bit more free, because we've got this really structured, solid roadmap that we're using. So I do get kind of tight when it comes to finding these shadows, and especially in these types of forms. Now, the same is not true with the apples, because apples are natural. We know they're not perfectly round. So if there's a little bit of a wobble or it's not a perfectly round sphere, that's actually, you know, probably a lot more realistic. So don't feel like you have to have that same amount of tightness when you're making the outside edges of your apples. It's really just the bowl where we know that that has to be pretty accurate. I've got a dark shadow coming under here. And I think we're almost done here as far as finding those dark shadows. So we want this underpainting to be dry before we do our complementary color wash. So hopefully mine will dry pretty quick. Oh, I want to make this stem pretty dark. So I got to push this stem a little bit darker, because you see it's almost black in my reference. So I'll just push that a little bit darker. And then maybe we'll be ready to move on with that underpainting wash. All right, so for that wash, we're going to do a complementary color like I mentioned earlier. So basically complementary means opposite on the color wheel, but I don't always do the true opposite. I kind of push it a little bit and make it, I use colors I like to use, basically. But let's look at the green apples first. So the opposite of green is red. And so I think for my underpainting for the green apples, I am going to use quinacridone magenta, which is an awesome, beautiful color from Golden. I need to get a little more of it. Mine is dried on my palette here. I love this color, and it looks really fun under other colors. So I'm just gonna wash this in, and I'm gonna be loose with this. I'm not trying to stay in the lines. I'm going to be messy. I have this watered down right now, and I'm just gonna go over where my green apples are. And so this is gonna go over the shadows that I mapped out as well. This is just a wash over the entire apple. All right, so magenta under the green apples. Now, what do we want to do underneath these apples that are kind of like red and yellow? I'm going to call those orange. I'm going to kind of just, I know that some places they are much more yellow and some they're more red, but I'm just going to lump them together and call them orange. So the opposite of orange would be blue. But I don't think I want to do, well, maybe I do. Yeah, I'm going to do blue. Let's do blue. Okay, so I'm going to do phthalo blue green shade, which is an incredibly intense, like indigo blue. And so I'm going to water it down quite a bit, and I'm going to wash that in. where my other apples are. And my paint is very, very thin, but I'm working pretty quick, so I'm keeping it from dripping by just kind of catching those drips. And it's okay that it kind of went into my magenta area. I'm not worried about that. It's actually fun to let these underpainting colors kind of play together. So if yours is dripping a little bit, don't worry about it. All right, add a little more blue color in there. Just want to deepen my blue in the areas that I know are going to be a little bit darker. We'll start off with it being a little on the darker side. Okay, now the bowl and the background are similar tones, and I'm gonna wanna separate those a little bit. But the bowl, basically we're gonna call the bowl brown. And so it's like a warm reddish brown. So we're actually just gonna call it red. And so I think the opposite color for red, well, I know the opposite color for red is green. So I think we're gonna put down some phthalo green, blue shade, over the area that is going to be that brown bowl. Again, I'm not worried that if it goes into my apples, it's gonna be fine. All right, so we've got that part washed in with the underpainting. Now, we've got the background, which is pretty dark and just kind of a neutral. I think just to separate the background a little bit more from the foreground, I'm gonna go back to the blue. I don't wanna use the green in the background also, so I'm gonna go back to my blue and wash that in with the blue. I don't usually like to do more than maybe three different colors in my underpainting. And that's just because I feel like it's too busy. So I usually try to kind of limit it to about 3. I'm just looking at the comments here. Let's see, Mickey said, could you share a little more about your thought process when you decided blue behind the red yellow? I would have guessed you would have done purple. So Mickey, I thought about purple because opposite of orange is, technically the opposite of orange would be blue. The opposite, is that right? Yeah, the opposite of yellow would be purple. So I guess I chose the blue because we've got this red in here. But we totally could have done purple as well. So good call on that. Those are kind of interchangeable. All right, so in the foreground, we've got like this patterned cloth, and there's areas of beige and areas of blue. I'm just gonna call the whole foreground blue. So if the foreground's going to be blue, my opposite, I want to be a warm tone. So I'm actually just gonna go back to my magenta, because like I said, I don't wanna have too many different underpainting colors. So I'm just gonna wash in what's left with magenta. I know I get a lot of questions about choosing the underpainting colors. I know a lot of people are worried about maybe choosing the wrong underpainting colors when they're doing this on their own. And I really don't think that you can mess that up. As long as you're kind of playing off of either cool or warm and doing the opposite, there's a lot of freedom with what you're going to choose for that wash. Let's see, Judy's asking, would this work on a canvas board instead of wood? So Judy, it would, but I don't really like to work on canvas because I have a hard time showing my brush strokes when I work on canvas because you tend to see the weave of the canvas quite a bit. So I prefer a smooth surface. If you are working on a rougher surface like a canvas, you might need to just use more paint to get it to like move and flow. But I do prefer that smooth surface. So this is a masonite board front, and this is a panel that I had made, and I just have a carpenter kind of build out the sides for me. All right, so before we move on to actually putting down the actual color, we want to make sure that all of this wash is dry. So I'm just going and kind of scooping up some of my drips. So if you have any areas that are dripping, you'll just want to grab those. I'm blotting my brush on my rag here to clean it off a little bit before I start layering in the color. So the first color that I put down was the magenta, so this is probably the most dry. So I'm gonna go in and start building out my green apples first. And I'm actually gonna use a pretty big brush because this is a pretty large mass that we can put some large blocks of color. So I'm actually gonna go in with my number 7, I think. I like to tell students, use the largest brush that you can to get the job done rather than having a bunch of tiny little hash marks. If we've got a large area, we're just gonna lay down a fat stroke and be done with it. Okay, so let's make our green. So we're gonna make the green using, I gotta find a clean spot on my palette. This is clean. We're gonna use Hansa Yellow Opaque, tiny bit of Phthalo Green Blue Shade, like teeny tiny amount, because it's super strong. Like I hardly touched it. And it's really changed my color here. But now we need to dull this down because otherwise this green would just be like too intense and give you a headache. So I'm gonna put some alizarin crimson in there to dull it down. I maybe put a little too much in, but maybe not. There are some of those kind of gold colors. Yeah, maybe not. All right. So now I'm going to thin my paint using Glazing Medium or Matte Medium. So I'm using Liquitex. You can use any brand. I'm not picky about that. You could use Golden. I usually buy the Liquitex for the glaze because it's a little bit cheaper and I don't feel like it really matters so much for the brand. So from here on out, we're not thinning with water, we're thinning with glaze. Okay, so I am starting to look for some of the mid-tones. I'm not going to the darkest shadows. I'm just kind of filling in some of these mid-tones. And I'm also going to be very careful about showing that pink underpainting and not covering it all up. So I'm gonna leave some spaces between my brush strokes, but basically as we jump in with this first color, I put a little too much glaze in there. I feel like it's not standing out as not enough. I'm gonna make a little more paint. As I'm doing this first color, I'm just trying to get some paint on the panel. And then we'll push our highlights and shadows more in the next layer. We're kind of starting in the middle. All right, I mixed up more paint here, so I put more of all 3 colors in because I had a little too much glaze in there. It was too transparent. I wanted it to stand out a little bit more. Let's see, Laura's saying there's 3 types of those brushes. I got the white, it's not as sharp of a chisel. I ordered the golden. Oh, you know what? I use the white ones sometimes. I don't really see a big difference there, but it's also possible that they kind of changed them because it's not always exactly the same. But I think you should be able to use the white ones too. The Royal Langnickel brushes that I'm using. All right, so we're just getting some color on here. Now the brightest part of this apple is right here, right? So I'm gonna leave that for right now until I come back with a brighter tone of my green color here. So I'm gonna move on to this other apple and I'm just gonna lay down some fat strokes. And then we're gonna move into the next one. And I'm gonna use this to make that little shadow for the stem. Okay. Okay, I think we have enough of this color. Now I want to go in and make it brighter. So the way that I'm going to do that is by adding some white. So I can actually just use my same recipe here, and I'm gonna add some white to it. That's gonna brighten it up. Maybe I'll add a little more yellow as well, and maybe a pinch more green. So I'm adding the other colors that are not the red. The red, or the alizarin crimson, is what dulled it down. So by adding more yellow, more green, and more white, we're getting more of like a springy kind of lime green. It's also making the paint a little more opaque because we're having more paint now compared to the glaze. I didn't add any more glaze. So I'm looking for these brighter areas on the apple. And see, this is actually kind of a big jump in tone from what I had put down before, but I'm okay with it. I'm not trying to blend it into my earlier tone. I'm just kind of setting it down next to it, letting them sit next to each other and play off of each other. I may switch to a smaller brush now, but maybe not. And you see how when I'm laying my brush strokes down, I'm thinking about the direction of the apple. So it's kind of like I'm wrapping around the apple. And that helps to give that illusion of form. By being aware of that as I lay down my brush strokes. Let's see, Luis is asking, are you using mostly fluid acrylics? Yes, these are all fluid acrylics from Golden, Luis. I don't particularly like heavy body paints, but that is totally just my personal preference. I don't really work so much with physical texture in my paintings. I just kind of build a visual texture. So I don't really need the heavy body for that. All right, moving on to this one, pulling out those highlights, wrapping around the apple. And we're gonna go even brighter yet, but this is just kind of gradually working our way towards those highlights. And I'm also not being like calculated about where I'm leaving my little bits of pink. So if you start to feel like you're evenly spacing these little windows of pink very perfectly, I guess, that can kind of work against you. And our brain has a tendency to want to do that. So to make it look natural, you want it to feel kind of random where these little areas of that underpainting are poking through. Hi Judy, thank you for sharing this demo and for reminding me to ask you guys, if you are enjoying this demo, would you please hit the share button? I would so appreciate it. I do these demos every week, and it's really a great way for me to kind of introduce my teaching to a lot of new artists. And so a lot of that happens because of you guys who share my demos every week. So thank you so much for doing that. And if you hit that share button, you can come right back to the demo. So it doesn't change anything. I'll still be here, and I really appreciate you guys doing that. All right, so we're gonna add more highlights on these green apples, but we're not going to do it yet because this paint is wet. And if I try to put highlights on top of wet paint, they're not gonna stand out like I want them to. So I'm gonna let these be for right now. And I'm going to push a little bit darker. You see how I left this whole wedge of pink here where I have a dark shadow? I haven't done that dark shadow yet. So now we need to go back towards the darker greens. And so for my darker greens, I'm gonna move to a new spot on my palette. I'm not gonna use this same well because I feel like I have too much white in there to work with that. So for my new dark green, I'm going to still use Hansa Yellow Opaque, Phthalo Green Blue shade, and a little bit of alizarin crimson, and a little bit of white. But you can see now how I definitely have more of that phthalo green in my mixture. And I'm gonna add a little bit of glaze in there to make it transparent. I think I put a little too much white in. I'm building up my color a little darker. So I'm trying to match this dark tone that I see in that shadow on that front apple. And it feels like kind of a big jump, but again, I think it's gonna be just fine. It's kind of overlapping in some places since it's transparent, letting some of that other green tone show through. Just looking for these dark shapes. And maybe that's enough on that one for right now. I don't want to overdo that. Okay, now I'm going to look for my dark shapes here. Got a dark shape on this one, and it's really just this apple that's casting a shadow onto the apple next to it. Got a shadow. So these shapes are all just kind of bouncing off of each other and playing with each other. And that, that's a fun thing about working with a still life. You can try different arrangements and see how these just really basic shapes play off of each other to create interesting shadows and colors. I definitely recommend practicing still life painting if you are new to acrylic painting, because it's less intimidating, Painting a portrait or, an animal or something can be a little bit more challenging, although totally possible. And I have some great classes to help you with that. But a great place to start is the still life. And I do have a course called the Lively Still Life where I go very in depth painting 3 different samples. But you can find that class on my website. All right, so now I think we can go back and do these highlights on the green apples because this is dry. So now we can really pop out these shiny, bright green highlights. I'm gonna clean my brush off really well so I don't have any of that dark green on there. And I'm going to add more white to my light green that I was using before. So it's going to get even more opaque because white makes things opaque. And I'm going to add a pinch more of my phthalo green in it. So it's going to make it a little bit more almost like minty. I think that's going to really pop. So I want this new highlight to be a few notches lighter than the highlight I had before. And I'm going to drop it in just where I see it the brightest, thinking about the direction of the shape. We've got a highlight on the back side of the apple here. I'm wrapping around that stem. I should have gone to a smaller brush. I have my huge fat one, but I can get in there. It's okay. Okay, a little bit right there, maybe a little there. All right, that's enough on that one. Let's do the bright highlight on this one. And don't blend these highlights in. If you feel tempted, just lay them down and let them sit. Because they lose their impact if you mush them all together. All right. All right. I think that's good for right now on our green apples. Let's move into our yellow and red apples. So let's find our yellow highlights first. Now these apples are a little bit different because they're like two-toned. So we're gonna have some red highlights and we're going to have some yellow highlights. But I think it'll be easiest if we find those yellow highlights first. So we'll make our yellow using Hansa Yellow Opaque, and I need to get myself some Pyrrole Red Light. The hole in the bottle always gets clogged, so I always keep a nail nearby to stick it in there, because otherwise if you just squeeze and then all of a sudden it becomes unclogged, the paint goes everywhere, and I definitely have learned that the hard way. So Hansa Yellow Opaque, Pyrrole Red Light, and it's going to make kind of like a golden orangey tone. And I'm going to put a little bit of titanium white in there. And I'm going to add some more yellow. We do have some almost green tones on these apples too, so I'll drop that in later. Yeah, okay, so let's find these yellowy highlights. And actually this yellow tone is going to look a little bit green because we are layering it on top of blue. And I'm sure you guys know yellow and blue make green. So when we layer on top of the blue, it's going to tint this yellow, make it look a little bit more green, which was one of the reasons why I added that pyrrole red to it, because I knew I needed to make this yellow be a little bit more on the warm side to contrast that blue that's going to be poking through in between my brush strokes. So I was kind of thinking about that ahead of time. All right, I think that's enough on that one. I'm going to look for these yellowy highlights on my other one. Oh, I also wanted to remember to tell you all that all of my 2021 downloads for the outlines of all of my weekly paint-alongs are available on my website, but only through December 15th. So once you purchase them, they're $10 to get the outlines. Once you purchase them, you keep them forever, and the videos will stay available. You'll have a link to the video, but you won't be able to buy the outlines of the 2021 demos after December 15th. So if there are some that you're still interested in grabbing, you definitely want to head over to my website, lekstudio.com, and make sure you grab those before they disappear. And we're gonna do something a little new and different for 2022. I'm gonna keep that a secret for right now, but I've got some exciting stuff going on for next year. Okay, so we've got that yellow in. Now let's find our red. So for the red, we're going to use alizarin crimson and a little bit of white and a little bit of Hansa Yellow Opaque. So this is kind of like a duller, more of a burnt orange red. We're gonna start with it a little more on the dull side, and then we'll put some pops of brighter red in after we build up some of these more dull reds. Okay, so again, I am still leaving those little windows of that blue poking around. And this looks kind of dark because it's layered on top of the blue, but we'll brighten it up, like I said, with some of those red highlights. We're kind of building up some of the darks first, which will give our highlights somewhere to sit. It gives them something to sit on top of. All right. Okay, so we kind of just broke these apples into two forms, like some of it is yellow, some of it is red. But now, as we put in some of these highlights, it'll help to kind of fuse that separation together a little bit so it doesn't feel so separate. So let's go in with some of those red highlights. So I'm gonna use the same puddle of red that I had, but now I'm gonna put some pyrrole red light in there and a little bit of white. I'm gonna add a little more yellow in there. So this is going to make more of an intense orangey red. And just popping this into a few places where it's contrasted by that darker, duller red, that's gonna be really nice. So where do we wanna put these bright pops? Definitely right here, it feels pretty bright. Again, thinking about the direction of the brush strokes, working with what I've got there. I think a lot of the reason why I do this, or why I know to do this, to think about that brushstroke direction. I think a lot of it comes from my drawing classes that I took when I was in college. I did a lot of drawing, well, and in high school, but kind of learning that fundamental of showing form through line, that translates into paintings really nicely. So there's a reason why drawing gets stressed in art school, I guess. Not that you cannot become an amazing painter without drawing, because I actually don't really like drawing. It's okay, but it's not my favorite. I would much rather have a paintbrush in my hand. All right. Okay, so that's kind of like bridging that gap a little bit. Now we're gonna put some brighter highlights on these yellow areas, and I think that'll make those pop out a little bit more. I'm gonna clean off my brush. So we're gonna go back to the yellow recipe that we had, and I'm going to add more white into it and a bit more yellow too. So I had that pyrrole red in there before, but now I'm just adding more of the yellow and more of the white to put those brighter highlights in. Oops, I accidentally got a little bit of magenta in my mixture. I didn't want to do that. Maybe I'll be okay. All right, so where do I see the brightest tones? Probably right here. Don't be afraid of high contrast. That's what creates form. I think it's tempting to be worried about having too much difference between your colors, but I really think that is what makes paintings pop. You know, I'm gonna put a little of this onto this apple. I just feel like I see some of that bouncing down. Colors definitely bounce off of each other on objects in a still life. Well, in anything really. Like if you're doing a portrait or flowers or anything, colors are always bouncing off of each other. And that's something that I think can get lost in a photograph sometimes. We don't always notice how those colors are reflecting and bouncing, but it's something you can capture really nicely in a painting. All right. I think that's good for right now. I want to move on. I probably will put more color into these apples, but for right now, I want to keep it moving. Actually, I want to put a few more highlights on this red one. I feel like there's some orangier highlights there. I'm going to make a bright orange with pyrrole red, Hansa yellow, and some white. I'm going to get some fresh white because my white was kind of contaminated. I need to have fresh white to make this super bright orange. Yeah, that's the color I need. So it's almost like a bright peach. And I'm going to drop that in. Just in a few places on this one apple. Maybe a little bit up here too. Just felt like the red needed a little more dimension. Okay, that's better. Okay, so now let's put some color on that bowl because I want to cover up that green that's just kind of bothering me. All right, so we said the bowl is going to be basically brown. I didn't include any brown paint in my list. Sometimes I use burnt umber light, but since I didn't put that on the list, we're gonna make our brown. So we're gonna use alizarin crimson and some Hansa yellow opaque and some Payne's gray. And that is how we're going to make brown. So we will put this in the very darkest areas first. I don't have any white in here, so this is just alizarin crimson, Payne's gray, Hansa yellow opaque. And I'm gonna drop this into these super dark areas first, which we've already built up pretty dark, but it's gonna push it a little bit darker now. This is like almost like a chocolate brown here, and that's gonna make the apples pop out at us even more. Put this dark tone in the shadows. And then I know it's pretty dark under the bowl here, or on the underside of the bowl. along that edge. And this dark shadow is casting onto the apple here as well. And actually we've got a dark shadow in between those two that I'm gonna pump up. So we were kind of starting with those midtones, pushing towards the highlights. Now I'm pushing back towards the darks. Okay, and we've got some dark along the edge. Now I'm going to lighten it. So I'm going to lighten it by adding a little more yellow in there. Judy, I don't have any glaze in there. I just put it down kind of opaque. But now that I do the next tone, I think I am gonna add a little glaze. Jacqueline said I did have it on my list. Oh, I had burnt umber on my list? Okay, I forgot. Sorry about that. It's a good color to have. Hopefully you didn't get it just for the demo, but definitely good to have on hand. Okay, so now I've lightened my brown. I'm gonna add a little more yellow in there, lighten it a little bit more. A touch of white to lighten it up. And some glaze, and drop this into some of the slightly lighter tones in the background. I need to go even lighter though when I do this rim, because that's much lighter. So I'm gonna add more white, considerably more white. And I'm gonna drop this into the rim. And this is one of those places where you really wanna be steady, because we don't want that rim to seem wonky. And I think I needed to lighten it a little more. It feels too dark. I'm gonna add some more white. I can still leave some of the little bits of that green showing. That's okay. Just want the stroke to feel smooth and not awkward. We've got some light coming in from the side there, so I'm just indicating that. Now I'm probably gonna come back and lighten a few, like it feels like this edge is really glowing right here. I'm gonna wait for this to dry and then I'll come back and lighten that a little bit. I wanna put some color in the background, and I think I'm going to push the background into more of like an orange tone since I put the blue down first. So I think for my orange, I'm going to do alizarin crimson and Hansa yellow opaque. That's my favorite recipe for like a burnt orange. So we're gonna do those two, and I think that'll make a nice burnt orange for our background. I'm gonna put a little glaze in there to let that blue poke through. And we'll drop some of this into the background. You see how I'm like changing the direction of my brush strokes to allow for just a little more interest and to allow those little windows of blue that are poking through just to be kind of random and interesting. I like to often leave a little more of those background colors at the edges of my panel. It's just kind of my personal preference. All right, now we need to do this color under the bowl. And I'm not gonna worry about like the weave of this pattern where we see these little dots. That's too much detail. That's not necessary. I'm just gonna call this all like a gray or kind of a bluish gray. So I'm gonna make my bluish gray with Payne's gray and some white and a little bit of phthalo blue. I think that's like that intense blue. The Payne's gray will dull it down a little bit. I'm gonna put some glaze in there. And that'll work. Okay, so this is going to go in kind of some of those mid-tones. Oh, I had a clump of paint in there. It's not going in the darkest shadows. It's also not going in the very lightest highlights. It's kind of starting in the middle. Same thing, kind of like how we treated the other areas, where we start in the middle, push our way towards the dark and push our way towards the light. And blue is always a nice color for shadows on something that is kind of neutral or white. So I'm painting in between these stripes here in the shadow area with the blue. In the area that's highlighted, I think I'm going to switch and make that lighter. Hopefully that makes sense. So I'm going to add some more white to this. This again is Payne's Gray, Phthalo Blue, and white. Now I've added some more white to it, and I'm painting these white stripes in the areas that are in highlight. So we have this dark blue shadow coming from the apple, and so it's having an impact on these stripes. And then we've got some highlights here. Want to leave some of that fun pink showing through. That's good. Okay, so now I left basically just that purple underpainting in our areas of shadow. I'm going to put in those shadow areas now with kind of a darker blue. So I'm going to add more Payne's Gray to my recipe. Need to get myself some more Payne's Gray. Getting close to the end of the demo, and I need to finish on time. Last week was my husband's birthday, so I was meeting them afterwards for dinner, and today is my son Wilson's birthday. So we have lots of fall birthdays, and so we are gonna go meet for dinner after this, so I can't be late. All right, so this just has more Payne's Gray in it. I'm making a darker tone. This is what I'm going to use in the shadows. So I'm not going to cover up all of the purple that I've put down in the shadow, but I'm just going to start to build up some color there. I'm going to lighten it a pinch to get this blue stripe that goes into the highlight. All right, so just to make it like less confusing, I didn't treat these stripes as like a beige or brown like they are in the reference image. I'm just calling them all blue. It just makes it easier. Okay, so I want to go back and bring this highlight on the rim of the bowl. Thank you everybody who's wishing Wilson a happy birthday. I'll have to let him know that you guys said that. Okay, so let's go back to that highlight, and you know, I think it would be fun to actually make it almost like a purple. So I'm gonna do quinacridone magenta, and I'm gonna use a little bit of Payne's Gray and some white, and I'm just gonna make like a shiny purple highlight on that rim of the bowl, just for fun. Purples can be in shadows and highlights. And I'm going to be really careful about the shape of this because I told you that's super important. I'm not going to do it all the way around. I'm going to pick it up over here. So, sorry guys, I think I lost you for a second. Guess who was calling me? It was the birthday boy. He probably wanted to know if I was done. So, I guess that means I need to be done, huh? All right. Where else do I want to drop this purple in? I'm going to put some into the shadows here, kind of playing around. Just a few places. I want to make this part of the rim just a bit brighter too, but I'm going to add a little more alizarin crimson to this to darken it a little bit. So So I can give some variety of that rim edge. Yeah, I like that. Actually, I think I want to put some of that color inside the bowl too, just to bring that tone in. Yeah, that seems to make sense. You see how my brush strokes are like wrapping the edge? Let's go a little bit brighter here too. I'm gonna go back with even more white in that same mixture and just push that a little bit brighter. Yeah, there we go. Just needed to be a bit brighter. It wasn't quite there. Okay. We are almost done, but I want to pump up the highlight on the green apples a bit more. So I'm gonna come back with almost straight white. I'm going to do white with so a tiny, tiny bit of phthalo green and a tiny bit of yellow. I'm gonna get myself some clean yellow, and I'm gonna make a really bright highlight. A lot of white, just a little bit of yellow and green. I'm gonna make a really bright highlight on each apple. Maybe not that one. Okay, yeah, you see how that's even brighter than what was there? It really makes the apple feel shiny. I guess we didn't map out the stems, but it's okay. Got a bright edge here. Yeah. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna come back with a smaller brush. I painted almost that whole thing with a number 7 brush, and I just went down to a smaller one towards the end. But I'm going to grab my number 1 brush. Sorry guys, that was the birthday boy again. That's why I lost you. Okay, so there's a little tiny highlight on the tip of this stem. Those of you that have children, you can, I'm sure, relate. They do not take no for an answer, do they? All right, and now I'm gonna push the other stems a little darker. I'm gonna use some alizarin crimson, a little bit of yellow, and a little bit of Payne's gray to make a dark tone, like a dark brown. We're gonna clean up the shape of the stem. Okay, same thing on this one. Just kind of shape it up a little bit. Getting more specific there. Maybe we'll push that dark a little on the other ones. And just clean up a few other little places that I want to push my darks maybe a bit cleaner. And I think I want to put a few minty green reflections just right there. I'm going to go back to a slightly larger brush, and I'm going to do some more green in my mixture that I had before that I was doing this highlight. So I'm just adding more phthalo green and a pinch more yellow. And I'm going to put like some minty green reflections on this apple in the shadow. Yeah, that's what it was. That we needed that. We needed just that little bit of contrast of kind of some cool green tones mixed in with these warm ones. Do you see what that does? I like it. That was necessary. Okay, but before I overdo it, because just because I like it does not mean I should put it everywhere, I'm gonna stop. All right, we're gonna call it done so that I can call Wilson back. And go meet him for his birthday. So thanks again, you guys. Again, if you haven't gotten the download yet, you can grab that on my website, allykstudio.com. You can also find all of the 2021 paint-alongs on there. Make sure you grab them before they disappear on December 15th. You don't have to do them by the 15th, you just have to get the downloads. So thanks a lot, guys. Have a great night. Happy painting. I will see you next week. Take care.